Greetings, my name is Hiba and I'm a volunteer for the World University Services of Canada at the Ontario Tech University chapter. The theme of today's episode is the crisis in Afghanistan, and we have our wonderful guest here today with us, Mr. Djawid Taheri, who is a practicing lawyer in Toronto. Thank you so much, Mr. Taheri, for joining us today.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
All right, so the first question I would like to ask is if you could please introduce yourself and share some of your personal experiences as the founder of the first Afghan-Canadian law firm in Canada.
Thanks. So my name is Djawid Taheri, as you stated. I was born in Afghanistan. I arrived in Canada myself as a refugee back in the 1980s. This was following the Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan in December of 1979. So I came to Canada. At the time, I attended high school. I did my high school in Toronto, then went to York University where I studied political science and psychology, and then went to Brock. I did a master's degree in political science. And then following that, I went to Osgoode Law School where I studied law. I graduated from law school in 1999, I think was a little over 20 years ago. And recently, back in 2019, I completed a master's of law as well at Osgoode Hall. So, essentially, I grew up in Toronto within the Afghan-Canadian community. At the time, it was very small back in the 80s. So we had our own organization of refugees and newcomers, helping other Afghans who were arriving due to the war and conflict in Afghanistan. I was quite involved even in high school and university years with the Afghan community. And ultimately what I noticed was, people were coming in, they were new, they didn't know what to expect, in terms of their rights, responsibilities, starting a business, family problems, criminal issues. But we didn't have a lawyer at all in the community. So this was one of the reasons why I ended up going to law school. And even when I was in law school, I was writing articles in Dari, Farsi/Farsi Pashto languages that were being published almost on a bi-weekly basis in a couple of different community organizations. But my goal was to make sure that people understand where they stand in terms of these legal issues that seemed quite daunting to them at the time. But for somebody who understands the system or studies law, it was quite basic stuff, And so that led to other programs. I had a radio talk show that I hosted for a while, for a number of years. People would call with legal questions and I would answer for them. And so in 2001, after I completed my articling period, I started my own law firm. And at the time, pretty much, I think I was the only lawyer in the Afghan community. So the bulk of my practice was kind of helping the community. And a lot of times it was pro bono work, it wasn't paid work, but I enjoyed it because you could see the difference you were making in the lives of these people, and I continue to do that to this day. And over the years, I've been part of various organizations that serve not only Afghans but refugees and newcomers, in Canada. I've been in their boards of directors. Been working with a number of mosques in Toronto, as their legal advisor, doing their work whenever needed. But on the side of clientele, my practice is criminal law, refugee and immigration, and real estate. So, in the past 20 years, I would say I've dealt with countless Afghan refugees. And myself, having come from that background, having suffered, things that I know they are suffering or have suffered, it makes my job easier in one sense because I can relate to them, but also, more challenging because you kind of feel the emotions of what they've gone through and what they, what challenges they're facing in this country and so on. So the stories that you hear, and it's more or less the same. Unfortunately, it's kind of a vicious cycle of violence in the past 40 years or more than 40 years now. The actors every decade or so kind of change, but the suffering, the problems with the civilian population and the crises there, it doesn't change. It's it's one day it's the Russians, the next day it's Pakistani forces, the next day it's Americans, and now back to Taliban. And so over the years, as a lawyer and as a community advocate, I've worked with a number of organizations to kind of bring awareness to the plight of refugees from Afghanistan and to make people understand how important it is to help them. And so, I've done some work in that, but you feel kind of sort of hitting a wall a lot of times. After August 2021 last year, I was quite active with a number of other lawyers and organizations trying to help shape the government's policies towards helping Afghan refugees. And at the time, at least we had an MP who had an Afghan, Maya Munsef, who was an Afghan-Canadian, who was at the forefront of this and was very helpful. Unfortunately, she lost her seat in the last election. But in those months between August to end of the year, we wrote to the government. We published articles and papers. We held high-level meetings with the Prime Minister, with the Minister of Immigration, Minister of Defense, Foreign Affairs, and kind of push them to take a stand against the Taliban and make sure that they can help some way. The people were trying to flee. They made a lot of promises, but so far we haven't seen a lot of result, unfortunately. We're still in touch with them, and we're kind of pressuring them to honor the promises that they made during the election. But so far out of the 40,000 that they had promised, I think we've had about between 5,000 to 8,000 people, maybe not even 8,000 people who have managed to come in, and they have their own challenges, a lot of challenges when they come to Canada. Not just because of their background, but also because of the trauma they have suffered. They're coming from a war zone country that has been in conflict and war for the past 4 decades. And so, naturally there would be problems. But the most, in my view, the most, the most vulnerable are the children in this conflict, especially, as it relates to education. You may have heard the Taliban announcement that was made last night, saying that despite their previous promises, that they're not going to allow girls to go to school beyond grade 6. And in the past, they had, kind of branded themselves as Taliban 2.0, saying, we're kind of different from the past. We're allowing people to, go to school and university and so on, and we're not going to have the same restrictions that they did back in the 1990s when they were in power first time. But it seems like it's going back to the same kind of routine. And so we would, if this government stays in power, we would have yet another generation of Afghans who would be uneducated, all the efforts that were made in the past 10 to 20 years, although only in the urban centers, even in the past 20 years, I would say, given my own experience with my clients who have arrived from Afghanistan, it hasn't been so great. And this is one of the reasons why I think the attention of the world community is also kind of focus is moving away, because a lot of money was spent, a lot of efforts made, but not money many results. And it's unfortunate because at the end, like I said, it's the younger generation and the future of that country that is losing. The people that would be able to help rebuild that country or establish some kind of normalcy and peace for that country is kind of going by the wayside because without education, as we know, it would be back to that same kind of violence, unfortunately. And so it becomes so much more important and critical for Canada or countries such as Canada and the Canadian people to try to help as many of those Afghans to move to other countries in order to get an education, because that's the only way that the future generation can go back and reclaim some sort of normalcy and peace in Afghanistan.
Regarding my next questions, I think you've already touched on them in your response, but the next question I wanted to ask is relating to some of the social challenges that Afghan refugees face when settling in Canada, and that relates to some of the most prominent culture shocks. So from your perspective, what are some of the most prominent culture shocks that Afghan refugees face when settling in Canada?
Well, culture shock is the feeling of disorientation, kind of confusion when you face a new culture, a new environment, and it applies to pretty much any newcomer coming to Canada from anywhere in the world. Because we're not talking just about we have different types of food or different type of understanding of what you wear or what's important to you in life, but ultimately it encompasses pretty much how you relate to society. Particularly overcoming the language barrier. Most Afghans coming to Canada, although some may have, the first group that arrived, they were interpreters who had helped the Canadian forces. And so at least those people would have some understanding of the language. But after that first group, and the newcomers who are arriving, the refugees, a lot of them are from rural areas, very little education, and so no language ability, no ability to communicate in this country. And so that kind of brings back the idea of, are they able to fully and effectively participate in their new society? And when you can't communicate, when you can't understand what's around you, then you can't take part, you can't participate in society. And that lack of participation kind of isolates people, no matter who they are, particularly refugees who already come with a baggage of trauma, of conflict and aggression that they have experienced. And so in a lot of cases, people who experience culture shock, they become depressed, they become anxious, they become frustrated with their surroundings. And if we also add the element of discrimination, racism, Islamophobia, anti-immigrant and anti-refugee sentiments in this mix, you can only imagine someone who's already so vulnerable and to the breaking point, what kind of impact it will have on that individual. And so it's a mixed baggage of different factors. Language is there, but in addition to that, the ability or the inability to be able to work in your own field, for example. We would have people who are doctors, engineers, or administrators, or people who work high, good jobs back home. They come in and they feel helpless because they can't speak the language, they can't find proper employment or adequate pay, living wages. They become resentful, and if, like I said, if faced with the kind of rhetoric that we recently, in the past couple of years, hear from the alt-right groups, they become fearful, they become depressed, and those are things that ultimately lead to problems at home. They would have family issues with their spouses, with their children. A lot of these refugees coming from rural areas, there's also a culture shock with respect to gender roles. They don't see, or they don't expect women to be able to, go drive, go to work, or go grocery shopping, or be able to participate fully in society. And so for those individuals, it's a different kind of culture shock. For women, on the other hand, coming from those exact same communities, it's a different shock in the sense that now they see that they have to do things that they've never done in their lives. And so it's difficult, particularly since a lot of these women may be illiterate. They can't even write in their own language, let alone foreign language. And so children, go to school. They because of the mass media, the way that Muslims in general are portrayed, or refugees in general are portrayed negatively, those people would face a different kind of challenge at school, unable to express who they are. They suffer kind of identity crisis that lead to bullying, lead to depression, lead to poor performance at school. And so, and the sad part is for those kids or youth, they can't get help from home either, because the parents are just struggling the same way with their own problems. And so, it's a situation where they can't fit in inside, and they also can't fit in, outside the home, and they also can't fit in inside the home. And for girls, I would say it's even more challenging, because not only do they face problems, because if they're wearing the hijab, they have their own challenges to deal with in society. But in addition to that, the parents have, limitations, restrictions, not as much on the boys, more on girls. And so this creates, extra challenges for young Muslim women when they come to Canada, until they find their way. And culture shock is supposed to be temporary, and hopefully it would be in most cases. Culture shock, wears off after a while, because, initially, from what I understand, you go through a different stages. At some point, people start to feel that they're part of the community, but it takes time, and at what cost? And is there anything that us as a society or the government can do to make that transition from that stage where they are at the most vulnerable state to where they become fully functioning members of society, where they can participate and not be resentful, and be able to contribute to society. And so I think in general, all immigrants go through this, but we have to be mindful of the fact that when we deal with a population that comes from a war zone, who has experienced horrible atrocities, seeing their own family members being slaughtered in front of them, running for their lives, and having nightmares every day about these experiences. Their experience and how they fit in this country requires a little more help than the usual immigrant who comes, they decide to immigrate to Canada by choice. And so the culture shock is an important factor, but we as a society can and should take steps to make sure that there are resources available to address those challenges and help them get on their feet sooner than later.
Now that we've discussed some of the social challenges that Afghan refugees may face, my next question is relating more to economic and legal challenges. And you would know well about the legal challenges being a lawyer. So what are some of the economic and legal challenges that Afghan refugees face when settling in Canada?
In terms of economic, I mean, as I previously mentioned, employment is a big factor. Most immigrants in general are having tough time, getting a job in their own field of study, even if they speak the language. When you put the language barrier into the mix, it makes it even more daunting for the person. And so, one thing that in terms of financial and economic issues, if you have a living wage, something that an income that supports your family, it gives you a sense of peace and calm. So at least on that front, I'm okay. And then you can go beyond the necessities and think about the bigger issues in society. But when you're constantly struggling with the most basic needs of finding food and shelter for your family, and you're restricted to that basic need, then you don't have time or energy to be able to go beyond that and think about the society in general, or participate in society, or become politically involved or socially involved, and so on. And so in terms of economic challenges, what the government can do a lot better in recognizing, or at least expediting the process for recognizing degrees, foreign degrees from abroad. And that's, it takes years for people to be able to work to get a document that allows them to recognizes that that their education is equivalent to the Canadian education. And we're not talking about law. I mean, law, okay, even that until very recently was a big challenge, but at least there are some changes on that front. But people like engineering, for example, it's math, right? And that math doesn't require a lot of. I mean, it does require, but it's the degree would be more or less the same as that in a Canadian issued in a Canadian university. So, but they are having a tough time, or medical, people with medical degree, same issue. We have people who are trained professionals, and yet they end up driving a cab, or working as a pizza delivery person, or doing some other kind of menial job for which they have no training or interest in. And so this takes a great toll on an individual emotionally. Imagine, working hard at school, going to university, getting a degree that you love, and not being able to work in that field. It takes a very, very great emotional toll on an individual, and it affects the person's self-worth, self-confidence, how they view society, how they interact with people. It affects everything in life for people. And so the government can do a better job on that front. Another thing that the governments can do, provincial and federal, or with respect to small businesses, assistance to newcomers, who have experience in business, and they don't know how to navigate the business world in Canada, because it's completely. I mean, ultimately, running a business is more or less the same, but establishing a business in Canada and dealing with those initial steps in a proper manner to make sure that they're on the right foot right from the start. These are things that would help a newcomer start their journey in the new country on the right foot and with a positive attitude, and also set them up for success, not failure. And so that's another issue that in terms of employment and economic side. Another thing that also affects economic and finances is obviously affordable housing. And that's not just, it's not just specific, obviously, to newcomers. All Canadians are having problems with housing and affordable housing and accommodation and so on. But this is more acute in the case of refugees. So imagine, somebody coming in, they have no work experience in Canada, they have no savings in Canada, they have, at that point, they may not even have a job, or and now they want to go find a rental housing, rental accommodation. It's very hard. My own clients, they have a lot of challenges finding affordable housing because affordable housing is already hard to get for any Canadian, but for somebody who is new to this country, it's beyond reach in many instances. And so that's another challenge that the government can help. And right now, a lot of these families, they come in they stay in shelters, and they're in shelters where they can't speak the language with the staff, with people, other residents. They have children who can't go to school. It's a mess in a lot of cases when they come in, and we're not talking about one or people who have been here for a couple of weeks. We're talking about people who've been there for months in those shelters. So the other issue that I kind of touched upon earlier in terms of legal problems is the situation of the gender roles or gender role reversal in a lot of times, and also how the home dynamics within the household, how it affects the interaction between spouses. And so for a lot of newcomers at the beginning, they don't know the laws in Canada. They don't know how the way you treat your spouse, how that's viewed under the law. And so in many cases, something that they in their culture and in their home, the way they spoke to a woman, for example, or things that they said may be interpreted completely different under the Canadian laws. And so we, at the beginning, a lot of these newcomers, and this is not specific to Afghans. I'm talking because in the past 20 years, I've dealt with a lot of domestic related conflicts and charges in Afghan and non-Afghan communities. And so this is another issue that requires education, requires settlement organizations in Canada who get funding from the government to actually have seminars to make sure that people understand the law, to make sure to say that disciplining your child in this manner is a criminal offense in Canada, for example. You can't do that, or behaving certain way towards your spouse could lead to criminal charges in Canada. And so these are other issues or challenges or struggles that they go through, and community in general, they can help. Again, like I said, through various organizations, mosques. I myself have participated in many of such workshops and seminars where I've discussed these very issues at mosques and women organizations and so on. And this is very critical. That when these newcomers come in, particularly refugees who are kind of plucked out and rescued or evacuated and brought like without a third country to kind of adjust to something new. They're just taken from their village one day, and a week later they're sitting in Canada, for example. And it's not a lot of them, but still we're talking about at least like 4,000 or 5,000 people. And so in those situations, it would be best if the government could actually have certain programs, education programs, not just language classes, but education programs using interpreters to educate them about the law in Canada. And that's something, you know, if people know that, you know, you can't behave certain way in this country, they won't do it. But if they don't know, you know, a lot of times, you know, they would tell you, but that's my son. I have the right to teach my son, you know, this is not the right way to, you know, to behave. The government is telling me how to discipline my child. Like, it's beyond belief for some people. And so it's important for the government or for these organizations that assist refugees to have certain mandatory workshops, seminars, classes, where these newcomers would actually go through a period, you know, where they would be taught about certain aspects of the law in Canada. I think it would go a long way in curbing those, you know, those problems. Another issue, legal issue, would be the immigration side. I mean, it's atrocious, the process, although in the past couple of months, things have changed a little bit. You know, things have, you know, are moving a little faster, but the whole immigration process in Canada is a very, very slow process. And for people who have arrived here, at least they are safe. But for people who have arrived here, but their loved ones, their spouses, their children, they're still stuck there. You know, they can't focus on their life in Canada. They can't, because they can't sleep, because all they worry about is what's going to happen to my children. Okay, I'm rescued or I've been evacuated because of my work, whatever. But under the circumstances, you know, they couldn't bring their spouses or their close relatives. And there's the process could take years. The other thing, of course, again, it relates to economic and finances, is, like I mentioned, the ability to start a business, ability to know your rights as an employee. You know, these are basic things that a newcomer who comes to this country, they, you know, you have workers who, you know, they're not used to this. They're not only that they're not used to, they're not even aware that employees have certain rights. And so, you know, you hear stories about, you know, these refugees working for $5 an hour, even in today's market. I heard was getting cash, but was getting $5 per hour, okay, working somewhere. And so, and this is something that was in 2021, okay, end of 2021 when I heard about it, and I know the person, we talked to him, and you know, that's not something, but that's even allowed in Canada, and so you know, but that person doesn't know that, and so, you know, when you have no knowledge about you know, what kind of environment you're in. You know, any money is better than no money for that person. They may think, you know, $5 is probably how much people get, and that's a good pay for me. And so, so things about, you know, basic things about employees, about business, about you know, how to avoid criminal charges. These are basic things that someone should know when they come to Canada. And if they don't know, as a newcomer with pretty much no knowledge of the English language, you know, they need help. Afghan community has proven to be a very resilient community in Canada. You know, it's a very young community, started in the 1980s, and yet, you know, if you look at the business sector, they're quite successful on the professional side. They're very successful even in politics. They've had elected officials in the government, and this shows that these refugees who come in, they are not going to be a burden on Canada, but they need some guidance at the beginning to kind of move them to the right path, so to speak. And once they're on their feet, once they pass that initial stage, they are actually very resilient and very creative, and they find their way in every area. I mean, when I go to some of these meetings with the Afghan in the Afghan community, Afghan-Canadians, I am pleasantly, surprised to see how many professionals in pretty much every field we have now today, working and high-level jobs, working in private sector, working in the government, in fact, drafting policies, and so and the majority of these people are the first generation or second generation. Their parents were the ones who immigrated. Some of them arrived here as children themselves. I arrived here when I was a teenager. Same thing when I look around my friends, my family, other people in the community. There was a point we lived Ontario housing, and in that community there were a number of other Afghans. And the other day we were just talking about it. One of those individuals is now justice of the peace. Another one is a police sergeant. Another one has 3 restaurants in Ottawa that he's operating. Another one has a chain of grocery stores across the GTA. And yet all these people at the beginning, they relied on government assistance because they were newcomers and they needed that initial help. But after a few years, they find their way and they become, contributing members of the society and help other Canadians and other newcomers in this country.
Great, that's wonderful to hear. The second last question I have kind of ties in some of the points you previously mentioned, but it kind of relates to our public engagement campaign. One of our public engagement campaigns this year at the World University Services of Canada is building welcoming communities, particularly for newcomers and refugees. So in light of that, what kinds of infrastructure and resources should the government provide in order to assist Afghan refugees in order to make their transition to life in Canada easier?
Yeah, our job as a community, as government, it should be more than just welcome. It should be working with these communities in such a way to enable them to achieve their full potential in this country, and they can do that. The government and community organizations, they have to recognize the needs. A needs assessment with these newly arrived refugee population is so critical to be able to focus the resources to the appropriate needs. As I mentioned, we're talking about people who have suffered a great deal of brutality and atrocities in their home in the context of protracted war, and so they suffer from PTSD, they suffer from war trauma, they suffer from anxiety, depression, so on. And so, having some kind of mental health resource for these newcomers, for these refugees, would be significant assistance in their ability to fully integrate into this society. Mental health assistance, counseling for the younger generation, for students, they come in, their parents are not aware of the educational system in this country. They may not have even gone to school, their parents, but the younger generation, the high school students specifically, they need counseling to enable them to understand how the system works, the Canadian system. What is the difference between college and university? What do they want in life, and how to achieve that through education? And those are things that that can go a long way if they receive that kind of guidance and assistance right at the outset from people who actually understand their circumstances, from people who know their challenges and know that they're newcomers, they don't know the system, and go through the basic things with them. It would go a very long way in establishing the future for that student. As I mentioned earlier, resources for small businesses. A lot of these newcomers who come in, if they see that their profession and their professional credentials are not easily or at all recognized in this country, they may try to start a business on their own, a small business. And so how to kind of set them up to start that business. And that again affects the economic side, affects how, like I talked about earlier, about going beyond the necessities of life. If they're financially able to take care of themselves, they can also think about bigger things in life beyond just work and providing food on the table. And so funding these organizations, to settlement organizations, to help them find jobs, to help them better understand the business environment in this country, or how to get their credentials in whatever profession they may be in. Those are important things that help them set up at the outset. The other thing is the government and community organizations should also aim for curbing, or at least having an impact on the rhetoric that we see so often nowadays about refugees taking our jobs, about these arguments about that refugees are a burden in this country, or that Muslims are violent, and we see that all over Canada now. It's not just in certain parts as before. We see that when we have jurisdictions talking, or political parties talking about so-called Canadian values, or jurisdictions in this country saying we will not allow stoning. Anyone who wants to live in this jurisdiction should make sure that they understand that we do not allow stoning in this jurisdiction. Those are merely dehumanizing a population. That's the aim. They know that nobody's going to do any such thing in this country, and even back in their own country, these things happen by people like members of the Taliban back in the 1990s. They were doing things like that, but not by the general public. But when you kind of push that kind of agenda, you also create suspicion on the part of the average Canadian. They, the back of their head, they kind of, if all they see are these negative portrayals of refugees and immigrants and Muslims, then if implicitly, if we look at it, consciously or unconsciously, they will be impacted negatively against that population. And so it's it's the job of all of us as a community, but particularly the political leadership, the community leaders, to always speak about this issue, to force the to kind of create a counterbalance to that kind of rhetoric. The media, the media doesn't just announce or report news. They kind of build the perception that people ultimately take away from a piece. And so when all we hear about in the news or in the mass media or negative portrayals of Muslims, for example, there are certain people in this country who would take that literally, and we end up with situations such as the mosque shooting in Quebec, or we have similar situations in the U.S. and in Europe. And so as a community, in order to make sure that these refugees and these newcomers actually feel at home, actually could become contributing and useful members of society, they have to feel like they're part of the society. And if all this othering is always happening through the media and through the political leadership, then they never feel at home. And if they don't feel at home, they start to become resentful. They start to not function the way, or not reach their full potential in this country. And so as a society in general, we have an obligation to make sure that we counter those kind of arguments or those kind of opinions. It's a free country, of course, free speech, but we should always speak up against it and provide evidence that kind of rhetoric has no real basis. It doesn't. There's no evidence to it, and and this is the real the evidence that this is what it shows about immigrants, about Muslims. We can't paint an entire community based on the actions of one or two cases that you hear about. And so, these kind of stereotypes impact refugees and newcomers in this country and how they establish themselves on a long-term basis. And so, any kind of help from the community and from the government to curb that kind of hate propaganda or hate speech would help go a long way. And so I think those are pretty much, it goes without saying, when it comes to how to help these refugees settle better. If you provide a safe environment for a family, they would prosper and they would appreciate, and they would ultimately do the same thing for another family who comes along next time around.
All right, so coming back to the theme of building welcoming communities and relating it to current international development issues. So I'll give some context prior to this last question. As we know, a terrible crisis is taking place in Ukraine, and we do hope that the leaders of the world can take the necessary steps to resolve the conflict. Afghanistan is also going through a humanitarian crisis, and yet there seems to be more reluctance on the part of Western nations, unfortunately, to help out Afghanistan and increase the volume of Afghan refugees, as well as refugees from other regions such as Syria, Palestine, and other Middle Eastern and North African nations. So in light of this, unfortunately, in your opinion, why do we see this preference towards welcoming certain communities over others?
Well, first of all, let me start by saying that our thoughts and prayers are with the courageous people of Ukraine for standing up for their freedom and independence. I was once in the exact same position that I see Ukrainian people find themselves today. Our country at the time was attacked by Soviet forces. They were bombing exactly the same way that they're bombing Ukraine today. we saw destruction, death, and this kind of protracted war for a decade at the hands of the Soviet Union forces. Back then it was Soviet Union, it fell afterwards, and now it's the same. It's Russia. And I know full well that the atrocities that are being committed there at the hands of the Russian forces, and consequently, I would be the first to say that Ukrainian people of Ukraine deserve help from every nation in the world today. That they need to be helped because they're under attack, and they are refugees, genuine refugees that should be assisted. But in response to your question as to why there's this reluctance to assist or bring more Afghan or other refugees from Middle Eastern countries or from African countries versus what we see, a little more willingness and speedier action on the part of the with respect to the Ukrainian crisis, I would say that media coverage for public perception and consequently political willingness, these are the factors that drive the change in how we saw the government response back in August 2021 versus what we see today with respect to Ukraine. Ultimately, when the media is fanning flames of Islamophobia or things about linking people from these Muslim countries to the actions of a few terrorist organizations in the world, then people, like I said earlier, people start to doubt things. It shapes their perception. It shapes people's views. And unfortunately, or fortunately, in this country or any other country, where elections, or elections decide who the leadership would be, people, politicians listen to the people and what they perceive as, public opinion. And so if the public opinion is on the side of Afghan refugees, they'll bring more Afghan refugees. If the public perception is more on the side of the Ukrainian refugees, they'll bring more Ukrainian refugees. Aside from that, we also, again, the portrayals of the media portrayals and the general perception about countries in the East versus countries in the West also creates this perception that these people may not be able to fit or adjust to Canadian life. Whereas for them, someone, for an average Canadian would say, someone who studied in Ukraine might have, easier time adjusting to Canadian life and finding a Canadian job, and would be a better candidate in the long run. That's how they view it, and whether that's correct or not. They also, the Ukrainian community also has a long established history in Western Canada. They have lived there for generations, and so consequently they have a lot of lobbying power within the government. We have some prominent politicians with Ukrainian ancestry, and so all these things help. That kind of kinship drives government policy at times. In addition to that, we have a David versus Goliath situation here, right? So we have a small country that was not expected to withstand, as the power of the Russian forces. People did not expect Ukraine to last as long as it has. The Russian president believed at the outset that he would be able to conquer the country probably within the next 4 to 5 days. And that, now I think we're closer to 1 month, and, there's no end in sight. And so, again, that kind of creates a narrative. It creates a narrative and a willingness. You see, you see President Putin, is globally known as a very evil person, as an evil leader, someone who oppresses his own people, someone who has a history of meddling in other people's, elections and politics and domestic affairs. Not a very nice person at all. And so, there's an identifiable enemy in the form of an individual. And so people can identify that that's a bad, evil thing. And what this population in Ukraine are doing is a courageous stand against an evil force. And so that in and of itself gives a positive kind of vibe to anybody following that crisis, in the sense that they see that someone is being pummeled, someone like us is put in a situation, without their own fault in any way. They're being attacked for no reason. Their cities are being destroyed, their people are getting killed. And so, is there anything that I can do as a human being? And so this is why we see this kind of grassroots support. Even, you may have heard people are actually booking Airbnbs with no intention of living there. Going there just to transfer funds to the average Ukrainians in the millions. And so these are the kind of things that that are shaped by how the media and how it portrays a conflict and how the general public views a crisis. And so in this crisis, it's very simple. You see good versus evil, and you can see it live every day. You can follow it, see what's going on. And so people are more willing. And so consequently, like I said, for the above reasons, the government also is taking that same route, and they're being very active in terms of their policy. Like I said, when it came to the Afghan issue, we were in the middle of an election. Okay, so there were a lot of promises made. But we had numerous meetings with government officials who promised certain things, and they haven't really delivered on that. Why? Because now the limelight, the focus has shifted. The focus has shifted to Ukraine, and while we have, we may not have planes bombing Afghanistan right now, but insidious things are happening where Taliban forces are searching house to house, looking for people that they believe are opposed to them, people who they believe worked with the previous government, people who they believe were human rights defenders, women rights defenders, and rounding them up and killing them quietly. And so we don't hear about that because it's not sexy enough for the media. And so it's a complex problem, and they can't kind of narrow it down to a a very simple thing that we see with respect to Ukraine. And so that, and the end result is that the Afghan problem kind of is put in the back burner. It's kind of forgotten, where, and we see other world conflicts and global problems that take their place. Unfortunately, that's how it works. In today's, digital world, in today's, we live in a world where we have instant access to information that's happening. You get hourly updates on what's happening in Ukraine, right? Whereas in Afghanistan, we don't have those same resources, those same capabilities. And so it's kind of, what we saw was the pandemonium that we've all watched, as thousands of people were running to the airport and trying to get out. That was something very unusual. So everybody took that up, and it was all over the news for a long time until it stopped. But aside from that, now we're talking about millions of people who are potentially dying of hunger. There are no jobs. The economy, just like any other world conflict, and the economy has tanked. The Afghan government assets have been frozen, and the parts of that is actually, according to Joe Biden administration, they're releasing it as humanitarian aid to the people, and how that's going to be distributed, how that is going to reach the needy, or whether it's going to go to the Taliban coffers, nobody knows. And I'm a member. I'm scheduled to appear as a witness, parliamentary witness, before the Special Committee on Afghanistan later this month. And that's one of my concerns that I want to raise, that, while we try to help the Afghan people, how can we ensure that the money that we send actually goes to the people and not assisting the Taliban government and further oppressing that population? And so these are challenges that are so complex that the media can't tackle it properly, and so consequently, what we see is kind of the Afghan problem kind of dying away, kind of going into the back side. And while I want to repeat myself in terms of Ukraine, I feel for that people, because we have suffered under that same armed forces decades earlier. And in fact, to me, the problems that we have in Afghanistan today all started with the Russian invasion in 1979, December 25, 1979. The country was not at war at that time. It was a peaceful country. It's a completely different country than what we see in terms of culture and religion. The people itself. It was the pinnacle point, the thing that dragged that country and its people into what we see today. It all started with that Soviet invasion in 1979, and has not stopped. So they were defeated in 1989. They left their puppet government in place, which was deposed a few years later. But in the interim, we created monsters in that country that are, that they're sucking the blood of that people to this day. It's just a vicious circle of violence that doesn't seem to end. And it all started with the Soviet invasion back then. So, so when we see the same thing happening in Ukraine, we understand where this is going, and what's even more scary is that if Putin has ideas about recreating or discovering the former USSR legacy, then or glory, as he put it, then we'll see a lot more of this in the neighboring countries. You have Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Czech Republic, and and I'm afraid if the government, if the world leaders don't address this problem head on and take a proper stand against Putin, he's going to be even more emboldened, and this war is going to be a bigger problem that will affect a lot more countries than Ukraine in the future.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Taheri, for contributing your time to share your knowledge, experiences, and insights regarding the Afghanistan crisis.
Thank you. My pleasure. It was nice talking to you, and very insightful questions.
Ever since the Taliban takeover in August of 2021, extreme financial losses have occurred due to foreign donors, Afghan monetary assets, and international banking systems getting cut off. Coupled with other factors such as a collapsing healthcare system, plummeting wages, lower employment rates, surges in prices of basic needs, and restrictions on girls' education, the situation has become dire. About 23 million Afghans are currently facing starvation, and according to estimates by the United Nations, about 97% of the Afghan population could fall into poverty this year. The goal of the WUSC organization's Building Welcoming Communities campaign is to engage people in Canada in building welcoming communities for all newcomers to Canada. In light of this, the theme of this podcast episode was to raise awareness of the social, economic, and legal barriers that Afghan refugees may face when settling in Canada, and resources the government can provide in order to address such challenges. WUSC's Student Refugee Program is one of the major initiatives aimed at assisting with the integration of young refugees. The Student Refugee Program is a resettlement pathway that is offered to young refugees currently from Kenya, Malawi, Tanzania, Uganda, Jordan, and Lebanon to allow them to pursue post-secondary education in Canada. So far, a total of 69 Afghan students have passed through the Student Refugee Program between 1986 and 2002. In light of this, for the 2022-2023 academic year, WUSC plans to collaborate with the Government of Canada and their network of sponsoring universities, colleges, and CEGEPs to resettle more Afghan refugee students to Canada via the Student Refugee Program. We hope that this episode inspires you to do your part in helping to build welcoming communities for Afghan refugees, as well as all newcomers to Canada. Remember to follow the WUSC Ontario Tech chapter on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Thank you for tuning in to the Let's Talk About the Hashtag podcast series.